Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. I need everyone here to understand something before I tell you what happened that night in October. I'm a rational person. Always have been. I work as a dental hygienist. I balance my checkbook. I don't believe in conspiracy theories or ghosts or any of that. But what happened in my house was real, and the police reports can back me up on every detail. My son Jamie and I had been living in that old farmhouse on Willow Creek Road for about 8 months, just the two of us after my ex-husband moved to Colorado. The place was perfect for what I could afford. 2 stories, white paint peeling off the wooden siding, surrounded by cornfields that went on forever. The isolation didn't bother me. After years of fighting and yelling, the quiet was actually therapeutic. Jamie was 6, just started 1st grade, and he loved having all that space to run around after school. The changes in the house started so gradually that I'm embarrassed how long it took me to piece things together. First week of October, I came home from work and found one of the kitchen chairs turned completely backwards, facing away from the table. Not just pulled out like Jamie might do when climbing up, but deliberately turned around. I asked him about it while I was making spaghetti, and he just shrugged, said he'd been at school all day, which of course he had. Mrs. Foster had kept him after for reading group until I picked him up at 4. Then there was the basement door situation. I'm obsessive about keeping it locked because the stairs are steep and there's no railing. But 3 times that week I found it standing open, not wide open, just unlatched and pushed in about 6 inches, enough to see the darkness beyond. The bathroom window really got under my skin though. It's this small window on the 1st floor, painted shut when we moved in. I'd spent an entire Saturday afternoon with a putty knife and WD-40 getting it to open because the bathroom needed ventilation. After all that work, I always made sure to lock it. The latch was tricky. You had to push down hard while sliding it to the right. But that Friday, I came home to find it open about 4 inches. The white lace curtain my mother had given me sucked halfway through the gap, fluttering like something trying to escape. Jamie was at his friend Tommy's house that afternoon. I stood there staring at that window for probably 5 minutes, trying to remember if maybe I'd opened it that morning and forgot. But I knew I hadn't. The weather had been cold all week, frost on the grass every morning. I started doing things I'd never done before, checking every lock twice before bed, walking through each room with my phone flashlight even though all the lights worked fine, putting Jamie's baseball bat next to my nightstand. I even called Mr. Garrett down the road, asked if he'd seen anyone around my property. He said no, but mentioned something that made my chest tighten. 2 weeks earlier, he'd seen a beat-up green pickup truck parked at the end of my driveway around noon, just sitting there for maybe 20 minutes before driving off. He figured it was someone lost looking at their phone for directions. The thing is, I'd seen that same truck, or one just like it, parked at the gas station in town when I'd stopped for milk. The driver had been sitting inside, baseball cap pulled low, just watching people come and go. Saturday night was when I knew for certain someone had been in my house. Jamie and I had gone to the fall festival in town, got back around 8:30. He was exhausted, covered in face paint, and clutching a bag of candy corn he'd won at the ring toss. While he was in the shower, I went to the kitchen to make him some warm milk with honey, something my grandmother used to make me. That's when I saw it. The junk drawer was open about 2 inches. Not a big deal, except I'm compulsive about that drawer because it's where I keep the spare house key. Everything inside had been moved around, not ransacked, but carefully rearranged. The key was still there, but it was on top of everything else instead of under the old phone book where I always hid it. My bottle of pepper spray, which I kept in the back corner, was now in the front, cap twisted off. I didn't sleep that night. After Jamie went to bed, I wedged a chair under my bedroom doorknob and sat by the window watching the driveway. Around 2 in the morning, I saw headlights slow down near my mailbox, then continue on. Could have been anyone, but my whole body was rigid, listening for any sound that didn't belong. The next morning, Sunday, I found something that made me call the police for the first time. There were cigarette butts under Jamie's bedroom window, 5 of them, all the same brand. Marlboro Reds with the filter torn off in the exact same way. They were fresh, probably from the night before while we were at the festival. Officer Daniels came out, took photos, wrote everything down, but said without evidence of actual breaking and entering, there wasn't much they could do. He suggested installing cameras, maybe getting a dog. I couldn't afford cameras and our landlord didn't allow pets. Monday came and went without incident, which somehow made me more nervous. I kept Jamie home from school, told them he had a stomach bug. We spent the day in the living room watching cartoons, me pretending to fold laundry while actually watching the windows. I'd already decided we were going to stay at my sister's place in Indianapolis for a few days, just until I could figure something out. But she couldn't come get us until Wednesday because of her work schedule, and I didn't have money for a rental car. Tuesday morning, I dropped Jamie at school like normal. I couldn't miss another day of work without risking my job. All day at the dental office, I kept checking my phone, expecting something, though I didn't know what. Dr. Morrison noticed I was jumpy, asked if everything was okay. I just nodded, kept cleaning instruments, tried to focus on the familiar routine of sterilization protocols and inventory sheets. That Tuesday evening is burned into my memory with a clarity that makes me nauseous even now, 2 years later. I picked Jamie up from after-school care at 4:30, stopped at McDonald's for dinner because I couldn't stand the thought of cooking in that kitchen with all those windows. We got home just as the sun was setting, that golden October light that usually made the cornfields look beautiful, but now just emphasized how alone we were out there. Jamie ran upstairs to play with his Legos while I sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through apartment listings on my phone, trying to calculate if I could afford to break the lease. Around 7:30, I went upstairs to run Jamie's bath. The bathroom was at the end of the hall, and as I walked past the spare bedroom, I noticed the door was open. Not unusual, except I distinctly remembered closing it that morning because I'd hidden Jamie's birthday presents in the closet. When I pushed it open wider, my heart started hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. The window was open, screen removed and leaning against the wall inside. I grabbed Jamie from his room, told him we were going to play a game where we had to be really quiet. His eyes got wide, but he nodded, trusting me completely. We crept downstairs and I reached for my phone on the kitchen counter to call 911. That's when I heard it. The floorboards in the living room creaking in that specific way they did when someone stepped on the 3rd plank from the wall. The sound was deliberate, slow, like someone testing their weight. My phone was in my hand, but when I looked at the screen, there was no signal. 0 bars. We never had great reception out there, but I always had at least 1 bar in the kitchen. I tried the landline mounted on the wall, the old beige phone that came with the house. Dead. No dial tone, nothing. The cord was still connected to the wall, but someone had done something to it, cut it somewhere I couldn't see. Jamie was pressed against my leg, and I could feel him trembling. The living room was between us and the front door, and the back door was through the mudroom, but that lock had been broken since we moved in. I'd been using a wooden dowel to keep it shut. Another creak came from the living room, closer this time, and then a sound that made bile rise in my throat. A man clearing his throat, not even trying to be quiet anymore. He knew we were there. He knew we knew he was there. I pushed Jamie behind me and grabbed the biggest knife from the wooden block on the counter, the one I used for cutting watermelon. My hand was steady, which surprised me. All that shaking fear from the past week was gone, replaced by something primal and focused. I had to get my son out of that house. The footsteps started moving toward the kitchen, heavy boots on hardwood, no longer trying to hide. I made a split-second decision. The mudroom was our only chance. I grabbed Jamie's hand and we ran, yanking the dowel out and bursting through the back door into the cold October night. Behind us, I heard the man curse and his footsteps speed up, but we were already sprinting across the backyard toward the cornfield. Jamie was crying but running hard, his little legs pumping. The corn was harvested, so it was just stubble and dirt, nowhere to hide. But Mr. Garrett's house had lights on. I picked Jamie up and ran like I've never run before. my bare feet slipping on the cold ground, the knife still in my other hand. I could hear the man behind us, but he was slower, maybe not expecting us to run. We hit Mr. Garrett's door screaming, and thank God he was home. Thank God he had a shotgun. Thank God he believed us immediately and called the police while standing guard at his door. They caught him 40 minutes later, trying to hitchhike on Route 47. Bradley Morse, 38 years old, recently released from prison after serving 5 years for aggravated stalking and attempted kidnapping. He'd been living in his truck, the green pickup, and had been watching us for almost a month. The police found notebooks in his vehicle filled with our schedules, drawings of our house layout, even notes about what Jamie wore to school. He'd been breaking in while we were gone, learning our routines, waiting for the right moment. The prosecutor said he'd cut the phone line that morning after I left for work, planning to trap us that night. If we hadn't run when we did, if I'd tried to negotiate or hide upstairs. I don't let myself finish that thought. We moved in with my sister the next day, never went back to that house even to get our things. She and her husband drove out later to pack everything up. Jamie had nightmares for months, but he's doing better now. We live in a second-floor apartment in the city with 3 locks on the door and neighbors on all sides. Sometimes I miss the quiet of the country, but I'll never live somewhere isolated again. Never. The thing about living in a small town is that everyone thinks they're safe. I was 24, working as a mechanic at the only auto shop in Oakfield, Montana, and I'd been renting this little house on Cedar Lane for about 2 years. It sat right where the neighborhood ended and the woods began, maybe a quarter mile from my nearest neighbor, old Mr. Hawkins, who ran the hardware store. I'd chosen it specifically because after spending all day dealing with customers and their broken-down trucks, I liked coming home to peace and quiet. That Wednesday in early November, I'd gotten home around 7 after fixing a particularly stubborn transmission on a Ford F-150, eaten leftover pizza, watched some TV, and crashed hard around 11. My bedroom was at the back of the house facing the woods, and I always slept with the window cracked because I liked the cold air and the sound of wind through the pines. I woke up to a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't loud or sudden. That's what made it worse. It was this careful, deliberate clicking noise, metal on metal, coming from the direction of my kitchen. My brain, still foggy from sleep, tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was the heater kicking on, or the refrigerator doing that weird thing it sometimes did. But then I heard the doorknob turn, slow and controlled, followed by the faintest squeak of hinges. My back door was opening. The digital clock on my nightstand showed 2:47 a.m. in those angry red numbers. And I remember thinking how strange it was that I could see them so clearly when my heart was pounding hard enough to blur my vision. Someone was in my house. Not breaking in. They'd already done that part. They were inside, moving through my kitchen with a confidence that made my mouth go dry. For a split second, I tried to convince myself it was Mr. Hawkins. The old man had a spare key from when I'd had the flu last winter, and he'd brought me soup and medicine. Maybe something was wrong. Maybe there was a fire nearby or some kind of emergency. But Mr. Hawkins would have called first, or at least knocked. And he definitely wouldn't be creeping around at almost 3 in the morning. Then I saw the light, a thin beam of white cutting through the darkness of my hallway, sweeping left to right like whoever was holding the flashlight was checking each room. That's when I heard the second set of footsteps. There were 2 of them. My bedroom door was open just a crack, and through it, I could see that flashlight beam getting closer, accompanied by the soft shuffle of boots on my hardwood floor. They weren't trying to be silent anymore. They knew exactly where they were going. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, but my fingers were clumsy and thick with panic. The screen seemed impossibly bright in the darkness, and I fumbled to dial 911. But before I could even unlock it, I heard one of them speak. "Check the back room first," the voice said, low and rough but clear enough that I knew it wasn't anyone from town. It had this flat, emotionless quality that made my chest tighten. They were maybe 10 feet from my bedroom door now. I could hear them breathing, could hear the creak of leather, gloves or jackets, I couldn't tell. That's when I saw them through the crack in my door. Two figures in black ski masks, both carrying flashlights, both moving with this practiced efficiency that told me they'd done this before. The taller one had something in his other hand that caught the light. Might have been a knife, might have been something else, but I wasn't about to wait to find out. My window was still cracked open from earlier, and I knew I had maybe 3 seconds before they pushed open my bedroom door. I rolled out of bed as quietly as I could, staying low, and grabbed the baseball bat I kept leaning against my dresser, a leftover from my high school days that I'd never gotten around to storing properly. Thank God for lazy habits. The window was one of those old-style ones that slide up, and I pushed it the rest of the way open, wincing at every small sound it made. The screen popped out easier than I expected, falling into the bushes below with a soft rustle. I could hear them at my door now, the handle starting to turn. I didn't think, just threw one leg over the windowsill and dropped the 8 feet to the ground, landing hard in the wet leaves and mulch. My ankle twisted slightly, sending a sharp pain up my leg, but adrenaline is a hell of a drug. I was already running before I fully registered that I was outside, barefoot, in nothing but sweatpants and an old Metallica t-shirt, the November air hitting me like a wall of ice. Behind me, I heard shouting from inside my house. They'd found my empty bed. A flashlight beam shot out through my bedroom window, sweeping across the backyard, and I pressed myself against the side of the house, trying to control my breathing. The beam passed over the spot where I'd been standing just seconds before. Then I heard the back door slam open, the same door they'd come through, and boots hitting the wooden deck. "He went out the window," one of them called out, and there was something in his voice that sounded almost amused. "Circle around." He couldn't have gotten far. That's when it hit me. They weren't panicking, they weren't scrambling or arguing about what to do next. They had a plan for this too. These guys had thought through what would happen if I ran, which meant they'd been watching me, studying my routines, knowing I lived alone and that my nearest neighbor was too far away to hear me if I screamed. The woods behind my house suddenly seemed like my only option. I knew those trails better than anyone. I'd been hiking them since I moved in, sometimes taking my morning coffee out there on weekends. But running through them barefoot in the dark was going to be a nightmare. I didn't have a choice. I could hear one of them coming around the left side of the house while the other took the right. They were going to trap me in the backyard if I didn't move now. I sprinted toward the tree line, my feet immediately finding every sharp rock and broken stick in the yard. The second I hit the woods, branches started tearing at my shirt and face. I couldn't use the main trail, too obvious, so I crashed through the underbrush, trying to remember where the old deer path branched off. Behind me, I heard them enter the woods, their flashlights creating crazy shadows through the trees. They were maybe 30 yards back, but they had boots and lights while I was stumbling blind through thorns and fallen branches. That's when I remembered the old hunting blind about a half-mile in. It belonged to whoever owned this land before it got subdivided, and most people didn't even know it existed. If I could make it there, I could hide, maybe wait them out until dawn. But as I changed direction toward where I thought it was, I heard something that made my whole body go cold with a different kind of fear. One of them was talking on a phone. "Yeah, he's heading northeast through the woods," the voice said, casual as if he was giving directions to a pizza delivery guy. "Have them ready at the access road. No, we'll flush him out. Give us 10 minutes. There were more of them. They had people waiting at the road that ran along the far edge of the woods. This wasn't just 2 guys breaking into my house. This was a whole operation, and I was the target. My mind raced trying to figure out why. I was just a mechanic. I didn't have enemies, didn't owe anyone money, didn't know any secrets worth knowing. Then it clicked, and the realization hit me harder than any branch had. 2 weeks ago, I'd worked on a car that came in late, after hours. The owner had called the shop directly, offered cash, said it was urgent. It was a black SUV with out-of-state plates, and the guy wanted me to fix a damaged undercarriage. Said he'd hit a deer. But when I got under there, I found more than just impact damage. There was blood, human hair caught in the metal, and what looked like fabric from clothing. I should have called the cops right then, but the guy was standing right there watching me work, and something about his dead eyes told me to keep my mouth shut. I fixed it, took the money, and tried to forget about it. But I'd made a copy of his license plate on the work order, following shop protocol. The paperwork was still in my toolbox at the garage. Maybe they knew I had it. Maybe they thought I'd already talked to someone. Either way, they were here to tie up a loose end, and that loose end was me. I could hear them getting closer, their flashlights sweeping methodically through the trees. My feet were bleeding now, leaving a trail they could probably follow even without a bloodhound. The hunting blind was still too far, and with people waiting at the road, I was being herded like an animal. Then I remembered something else. The old storm drain that ran under the woods, part of the town's flood control system from the 60s. The entrance was near here, hidden behind a cluster of fallen trees from a storm last spring. It would be tight, dark, and full of God knows what, but it came out near the elementary school on the other side of town. I changed direction again, trying to move quieter now, using the sound of the wind to mask my footsteps. The drain entrance was right where I remembered, a concrete tunnel mouth about 4 feet high, half hidden by dead branches and leaves. The metal grate that should have covered it had rusted away years ago. I could hear water running inside, probably runoff from the recent rains, but it didn't sound deep. I didn't hesitate. I dropped to my knees and crawled inside, immediately hitting ankle-deep water that was so cold it took my breath away. The concrete was slimy with algae or something worse, and the smell was exactly what you'd expect from decades of stagnant water and dead leaves. But I kept moving, trying not to think about what else might be in here with me. The tunnel was pitch black after the first few feet, and I had to feel my way forward with my hands, touching things I really didn't want to identify. Behind me, I heard muffled voices at the entrance. "The blood trail leads here," someone said. Then a flashlight beam penetrated the darkness, reaching maybe 20 feet into the tunnel before the curve blocked it. "He went into the drain," the voice called out. "No way, you want to follow him in there?" Another voice answered. There was a pause, then, "Call the others. Tell them to watch the outlet by the school. We'll wait here." They thought they had me trapped, but they didn't know about the maintenance junction about 200 yards in where the tunnel split into 3 directions. I kept crawling, my knees scraping against the rough concrete, the water getting deeper as I went. At one point, something brushed against my leg, probably a rat, but I bit down hard to keep from yelling. The junction finally appeared as a slightly less dark space where the tunnels met. I took the left branch, which I was pretty sure led toward Main Street instead of the school. Let them wait at the wrong exit. The left tunnel was older, tighter, and partially collapsed in places where tree roots had broken through the concrete. I had to squeeze through sections on my belly, the water now high enough that I had to keep my chin up to breathe. But after what felt like hours but was probably 20 minutes, I saw light ahead, a storm grate looking up at a streetlight. I could hear cars passing overhead. I was under Jefferson Avenue, right in the middle of town. I pushed up on the grate with my shoulder and, miracle of miracles, it moved. I shoved it aside and pulled myself up onto the street, probably looking like something from a horror movie myself, soaking wet, covered in mud and blood, clothes torn to shreds. A car swerved to avoid me, horn blaring, and I stumbled toward the 24-hour gas station on the corner. The teenager working the night shift took one look at me and reached for the phone. Within minutes, I was surrounded by cops trying to explain everything while wrapped in a shock blanket in the back of an ambulance. They found my house empty, the back door still open, blood on the ground from my feet. But the men were gone. The cops did find the SUV, though, abandoned and burning in a field off Highway 18 about 3 hours later. The plate number I'd written down matched a vehicle reported stolen from Nevada 2 months earlier. They never found the men who came for me that night. The detective assigned to my case, a woman named Detective Reeves, believed my story. Said the burnt SUV had evidence of the hit and run I'd described, including DNA that matched a missing person from Reno. She arranged for witness protection, helped me relocate to a new state, new name, new everything. Told me I'd done the right thing by surviving, that my testimony could help solve multiple cases once they caught these guys. That was 3 years ago. I'm still a mechanic, but now I work in a big city where nobody knows their neighbors, and that's exactly how I like it. I live in an apartment building with security cameras and a doorman. I don't work late anymore, don't take cash jobs, and I sure as hell don't fix cars with suspicious damage. The FBI agent who checks on me every few months says they're still investigating, that the organization those men belong to is bigger than just a hit-and-run cover-up. Sometimes she shows me photos, asks if I recognize anyone. I never do. But every night when I'm lying in bed, I still listen for sounds that don't belong. The click of metal on metal, the careful turn of a doorknob, footsteps where there shouldn't be any. They say I'm safe now, that those men have no reason to come after me anymore since I'm officially in the system. Protected, my testimony already recorded. But sometimes I wonder if they're out there, waiting, watching, knowing exactly when I'll be alone, and when no one will hear me if I need help. Because that's the thing about predators who hunt in packs. They're patient, and they never forget. Pinewood, Arkansas was the last place I thought I'd find myself in August 2022, especially after swearing 15 years ago that I'd never come back. But there I was, driving past the faded population 8,000 sign with my press credentials in the glove compartment and 17 burglary reports spread across the passenger seat. My editor at the Chicago Tribune had been following the story through wire services, elderly residents getting robbed in broad daylight, no forced entry. Same pattern every time. The local cops seemed stumped, or at least that's what they kept telling the papers before the coverage mysteriously dried up after the 10th incident. Something about the whole situation stank worse than the paper mill that used to run on the south side of town, and my editor figured a hometown connection might open doors that stayed shut for outside reporters. I pulled into the Sunset Lodge around 4 in the afternoon, the August heat making everything shimmer like a mirage. The place looked exactly how I remembered it. Peeling paint, half-dead neon sign, same cracked asphalt parking lot where teenagers used to drink beer and make bad decisions. Mrs. Colbert was still manning the front desk, though her hair had gone completely gray, and the cigarette between her fingers had been replaced by one of those electronic things that made her look like she was smoking a pen. She recognized me before I even finished signing the register, her eyes narrowing behind those thick glasses she'd worn since the Clinton administration. "Well, well, Tommy's boy finally comes home," she said, sliding the key to room 12 across the counter. "Heard through the grapevine you're poking around about them break-ins. Let me give you some free advice. Sheriff Brennan don't take kindly to outsiders asking questions, and far as he's concerned, you've been an outsider since the day you left." My first stop the next morning was Mrs. Eleanor Hutchinson's house on Dogwood Drive, victim number 14 according to my notes. She lived in one of those ranch-style homes from the 60s, with ceramic gnomes in the garden and a doormat that said, "Bless this mess." She invited me in for sweet tea, her hands trembling slightly as she poured, though I couldn't tell if it was from age or nerves. The living room smelled like potpourri and cat litter, and she had to move a massive orange tabby off the couch so I could sit down. "They took my mother's pearl necklace," she said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue she pulled from her sleeve. "And about $300 I kept in the coffee can above the refrigerator." But the strangest thing was how they knew exactly where everything was. Didn't touch nothing else, didn't make no mess. Like they'd been in my house before, knew right where to look. I asked her about the police response, and that's when her whole demeanor changed. She glanced toward the window, then leaned forward in her recliner, the leather creaking under her weight. "Sheriff Brennan showed up about 2 hours after I called," she whispered, "even though we were alone in the house except for the cat. 2 hours and the station's only 10 minutes away. When he finally got here, he barely looked around, just took some notes and said they'd investigate. But here's what really got me spooked. When I was describing what was missing, he already knew about the coffee can. I hadn't mentioned it yet, was still talking about the jewelry. He tried to play it off, said all old folks hide money in the kitchen, but I saw that look in his eyes. Same look my husband used to get when I caught him lying about his poker games. Over the next 3 days, I interviewed 6 more victims, and the pattern became impossible to ignore. Every single one mentioned the sheriff arriving between 90 minutes to 2 hours after they called, despite Pinewood being small enough to drive across in 12 minutes. Mrs. Gladys Newcomb on Elm Street said she actually drove to the station herself after waiting an hour, only to find Brennan's patrol car parked out back, while the deputy at the desk insisted he was out on a call. Mr. Arnold Fishman told me Brennan had dirt on his boots when he finally showed up. Fresh red clay, like he'd been walking through the woods behind the old Hutchins property, nowhere near where he claimed to have been checking on a traffic accident. The most disturbing conversation came from Walter Briggs, a Vietnam vet who lived alone in a duplex near the railroad tracks. He pulled out a notebook where he'd been tracking every burglary, marking them on a calendar with red X's. "Notice anything?" he asked, pointing at the dates with a shaky finger. Every single robbery happened on days when Brennan was supposedly working solo patrol, no deputy with him. That evening I stopped by Murphy's Diner for dinner, figuring I might overhear some local gossip about the burglaries. The place was exactly as I remembered: cracked vinyl booths, flickering fluorescent lights, and coffee that could strip paint. I was halfway through my meatloaf when Carl Dobson slid into the booth across from me. Carl had been 2 years ahead of me in high school, still wore his class ring, and now worked at the hardware store. He didn't even bother with small talk, just leaned across the table and spoke in a voice so low I had to strain to hear him over the ancient air conditioner rattling in the window. "You need to leave town," he said, his eyes darting to the door every few seconds. "Tonight. Pack your stuff and go back to Chicago. You're stirring up things that've been buried for a long time. Brennan's got connections you don't know about, people who owe him favors going back decades. My brother-in-law tried to run against him for sheriff back in 2016. Started asking questions about missing evidence from the lockup. His house caught fire 2 weeks later. Electrical problem, they said. He got the message and withdrew from the race. I didn't leave town that night, which might have been the stupidest decision I've ever made, and I've made some real bad ones. Instead, I went back to my motel room and started piecing together everything I'd learned, spreading my notes across the bed like I was trying to solve a puzzle. The robberies, the delayed responses, the fact that Brennan always worked alone on those days. It all pointed to something, but I needed more proof than suspicious timing and red clay on boots. Around 11 o'clock, I heard a car engine outside, that distinctive rumble of a Crown Victoria that every cop car in America seemed to have. I pulled back the curtain just enough to peek out, and there it was. Brennan's patrol car, parked across the street with its lights off, engine running. I could see the outline of someone in the driver's seat, the orange glow of a cigarette occasionally lighting up their face. They sat there for 45 minutes, never moving, never getting out, just watching my room. The next morning, I woke up to find my rental car's back left tire slashed, a clean cut that couldn't have been from road debris. The woman at the front desk, Mrs. Colbert, suddenly couldn't remember seeing anything unusual the night before, wouldn't even make eye contact when I asked about the patrol car. The guy at the auto shop took one look at my Michigan plates and said he wouldn't have the right tire in stock for at least 3 days, maybe 4. I was stuck, and everyone in town seemed to know it. That afternoon, I walked to the library to use their computer since my motel's Wi-Fi had mysteriously stopped working. I just logged into my email to send my editor an update when Betty Garrison, the head librarian who'd been there since I was checking out Hardy Boys books, came over and whispered that Brennan had just walked in. Sure enough, there he was by the periodicals section, pretending to read a newspaper while keeping his eyes on me. He was a big man, bigger than I remembered, with arms like ham hocks and a gut that hung over his duty belt. When he knew I'd seen him, he folded the paper slowly, walked over to my table, and sat down without asking. "Heard you've been talking to folks," he said, his voice friendly enough but his eyes cold as January. He pulled out a tin of chewing tobacco, packed a wad into his lower lip, and continued. See, the thing about small towns is that people get confused sometimes, old folks especially. They misremember things, get times mixed up, make connections that ain't there. Mrs. Hutchinson, for instance, lovely woman, but she's been taking them anxiety pills since her husband passed. Makes her paranoid. And Walter Briggs, well, that man sees conspiracies everywhere since he came back from Nam. Can't trust everything you hear. He leaned back in the chair, making it creak under his weight, and I noticed his hand resting on his service weapon, not threatening exactly, but making sure I saw it. Now, I know you got a job to do, writing your little article for that Chicago paper. But sometimes the story ain't what you think it is. Sometimes it's just a bunch of break-ins by some tweaker passing through town, and a sheriff's department doing its best with limited resources. Nothing more interesting than that. That's when I made my second stupid decision of the week. I pulled out my phone and showed him the photo I'd taken of Walter's calendar with all the dates marked. Funny how this tweaker only strikes when you're working solo patrol, I said, watching his jaw tighten. And how you always seem to be on the opposite side of town when the calls come in. His face went red, starting from his neck and spreading up like spilled wine on a tablecloth. He stood up so fast the chair tipped backward, and for a second I thought he was going to grab me right there in the library. Instead, he leaned down close enough that I could smell the tobacco and stale coffee on his breath. You got no idea what you're messing with, boy. This ain't Chicago. Out here, reporters sometimes have accidents. Car goes off the road on a dark night. Maybe they fall down some stairs at that old motel. Happened before. Ask Jimmy Watts. Oh wait, you can't. He drove his car into Lake Buchanan back in 2014 after he started poking around in things that weren't his business. Tragic accident, they said. Brake lines can fail on these old country roads. He straightened up, adjusted his gun belt, and smiled, but it was all teeth and no warmth. You have a nice day now, and maybe think about heading home real soon. Tomorrow morning would be good, before something unfortunate happens. I left the library with my legs feeling like jelly, but I wasn't done yet. That night, instead of staying in my motel room like a sitting duck, I parked my rental, with its spare tire now on, behind the abandoned Texaco station, and walked back to the motel through the woods. I sat in the dark bathroom with the door cracked, watching through the window. Around midnight, sure enough, Brennan's patrol car pulled up again, but this time he got out. He had something in his hand, looked like a Slim Jim or maybe a lockpick set. He walked right up to my door, stood there for a minute listening, then started working on the lock. The sound of metal scraping against metal carried in the quiet night. It took him less than 30 seconds to get the door open. He stepped inside my room and I heard him moving around, probably looking for me or my notes. After about 5 minutes, he came back out, relocked the door, and drove away. I waited another hour before sneaking back to check the room. Nothing was missing, but my laptop was open to a different screen, and my notebook had been moved. He'd been looking for what I had on him, trying to figure out how much I knew. The next morning, I didn't run like he wanted. Instead, I drove straight to the state police barracks 40 miles away in Centerville. Turns out, they'd been getting complaints about Brennan for years, but could never make anything stick. When I showed them Walter's calendar and told them about the pattern, plus Brennan breaking into my room, they finally had enough to start a real investigation. They put me up in a hotel in Centerville for my safety and sent a team to Pinewood. Within a week, they'd cracked it wide open. Brennan had been running the burglaries himself, using his position to case the houses during wellness checks on elderly residents, then hitting them when he knew they'd be at doctor appointments or church. He'd stolen over $200,000 over 2 years. The FBI got involved when they found out he'd been selling some of the stolen items across state lines. Last I heard, he was looking at 15 to 20 years federal time. The part that still makes me sick is that everyone in town knew something was wrong but were too scared to speak up. It took an outsider coming home to finally expose what had been happening in plain sight. I never went back to Pinewood after that, but I heard they elected a new sheriff. A woman from Dallas with no connections to the old guard. Maybe things will be different now, but small towns have long memories, and I'm not eager to test whether they've forgiven me for bringing down their corrupt king. "40 minutes outside of Riverside, right off Highway 22, there's this diner that became my second home for about 2 years. At 23, pulling double shifts most days to save up for nursing school wasn't exactly my dream job, but it paid the bills. Nothing special about the place. Red vinyl booths with duct tape patches, a jukebox that only played half the songs you selected, and coffee that tasted like burnt rubber if you let it sit too long. But the tips were decent, especially from the truckers who rolled through at all hours, and my manager Frank let me study during the dead periods between lunch and dinner. That particular Saturday in early spring, I'd been there since 5 in the morning, and my feet were already screaming in my beat-up sneakers. The breakfast rush had been brutal, with 2 tour buses stopping unexpectedly, and I'd barely had time to grab a piece of toast before the lunch crowd started trickling in. Around 2:30, after the last of the lunch customers had cleared out, Frank told me to take a real break. I grabbed my jacket and headed out back where we parked our cars, desperate for some fresh air and silence. The afternoon sun felt good on my face after being under those harsh fluorescent lights all morning. I decided to drive down to the gas station about a mile up the road to grab an energy drink, something with enough caffeine to push me through the dinner shift. The road between the diner and the gas station was usually empty this time of day, just a straight stretch of asphalt cutting through dead fields and the occasional cluster of pine trees. I had my windows down, letting the cool air whip through my hair, when I saw it happen about 200 yards ahead of me. A woman was jogging along the shoulder of the road, wearing one of those neon yellow vests that practically glowed in the afternoon light. She had earbuds in, her ponytail bouncing with each step, completely focused on her run. Then this truck, a massive Ford F-350, dark blue with those aftermarket chrome bumpers, came flying around the slight curve doing at least 70 in a 45 zone. The driver must have been texting or messing with the radio, because the truck drifted right onto the shoulder. The impact was instant and violent. The woman's body flew through the air like a rag doll, landing in the ditch about 30 feet from where she'd been hit. The truck swerved back onto the road, fishtailed for a second, then just kept going. Didn't even tap the brakes. The whole thing happened in maybe 3 seconds, but every detail burned itself into my brain like someone had taken a photograph. My car screeched to a stop and I jumped out, running toward the ditch while fumbling for my phone. The woman was lying at an impossible angle, her left leg bent completely backward, blood pooling beneath her head and soaking into the dry grass. Her eyes were still open, staring at nothing, and I knew before I even reached her that she was gone. But I checked for a pulse anyway, my fingers trembling against her neck, finding nothing but cooling skin. I called 911, barely able to get the words out, telling them about the hit and run, describing the truck in detail, the color, the chrome bumpers, even the Georgia Bulldog sticker I'd noticed on the back window as it sped away. The dispatcher kept me on the line until the ambulance arrived, along with 2 police cruisers. I stood there in that ditch for what felt like hours but was probably only 15 minutes, unable to look away from her face. She looked young, maybe early 30s, with a small scar through her left eyebrow and freckles across her nose. Officer Dunham was the first cop on scene, a guy in his 50s with a thick gray mustache and a belly that hung over his utility belt. He took my statement right there on the side of the road while the paramedics worked around the woman's body, even though we all knew there was nothing they could do. I told him everything, the exact time, the truck's description, how fast it was going, the direction it headed. He nodded along, scribbling in his notepad with a pen that kept skipping, having to go over the same words twice. When I mentioned the Georgia Bulldog sticker, he actually looked up at me for the first time, his expression unreadable behind those aviator sunglasses. "You're sure about that sticker?" he asked, and I told him yes, absolutely certain. He wrote something else down, then told me I'd need to come to the station later to file an official report. said they'd put out an APB on the truck immediately. I went back to work in a daze, barely able to focus on taking orders or refilling coffee cups. Frank sent me home early when he saw me staring at nothing, my notepad forgotten in my hand while customers waited. That evening, around 7, I drove to the police station on Riverside's main drag, a squat brick building that shared a parking lot with the courthouse. The desk sergeant, a woman with bleached blonde hair and long acrylic nails, directed me to Officer Dunham's desk in the back corner of the main room. He was typing something on an ancient computer, hunting and pecking with 2 fingers, and barely glanced up when I sat down. "Just need to get this statement typed up official," he said, pulling out a form from his desk drawer. We went through everything again, him asking the same questions in the same order, me giving the same answers. But something felt different this time, rushed like he was just going through the motions. When we finished, he had me sign the bottom of the form, then did something that made my chest tighten with unease. He folded the report in half, not once but twice, making it into a small square, and tossed it into his desk drawer like it was a piece of scratch paper. Not in a filing cabinet, not in an inbox for processing. Just thrown in with rubber bands and paper clips and old candy wrappers I could see cluttering the drawer. "We'll be in touch if we need anything else," he said, already turning back to his computer screen. I sat there for a moment, confused, waiting for him to say something about the investigation, about finding the truck, about justice for that woman lying dead in a ditch. But he just kept typing, those 2 fingers clicking away at the keyboard like I wasn't even there anymore. I left feeling like I'd swallowed a rock, this heavy wrongness sitting in my gut. For the next 3 days, I checked the local news obsessively, waiting to see a report about the hit and run, about police searching for a dark blue F-350. Nothing. Not a single mention. I even called the station twice, asking for updates, and both times got transferred around until someone told me Officer Dunham would call me back. He never did. I couldn't stop thinking about that woman's face, those freckles, that scar through her eyebrow. She had to have family, friends, people wondering where she was. On my lunch break that Wednesday, I drove past the spot where it happened, half expecting to see flowers or a cross or something marking where she died. The shoulder was clean, like nothing had ever happened there. Even the blood in the grass was gone. Whether washed away by the rain we'd had or cleaned up by someone, I couldn't tell. Friday afternoon, I had to run to the bank to deposit my tips from the week. The branch was on the other side of town, past the police station, and I took the back route to avoid the lunch traffic on the main road. That's when I saw it. Behind the police station, in that fenced-off area where they keep impounded vehicles and patrol cars waiting for maintenance, sat a dark blue Ford F-350. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I pulled into the McDonald's parking lot next door to get a better look through the chain-link fence. Same chrome bumpers, same everything. And there, right there on the back window, was the Georgia Bulldog sticker, just like I'd described. But what made me want to throw up was the damage to the front right side. A dent in the bumper, a crack in the headlight, and what looked like dried blood and hair caught in the grill. I sat in my car for 20 minutes trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The truck that killed that woman was sitting behind the police station, had been there for who knows how long, and nobody was doing anything about it. My mind kept racing through possibilities. Maybe they'd found it and were processing it for evidence. Maybe the owner had turned himself in. But then why hadn't there been any news about it? Why hadn't Officer Dunham called me back? Why did he throw my report in that drawer like garbage? I thought about marching into the station right then, demanding answers. But something stopped me. The way Dunham had looked at me when I mentioned the sticker, the way he'd folded that report, the way this truck was just sitting there in plain sight, it all added up to something I didn't want to believe. Someone in that station knew exactly who was driving that truck, and they were protecting them. I spent the weekend paralyzed with indecision, barely sleeping, seeing that woman's face every time I closed my eyes. By Monday morning, I'd made up my mind. I drove 40 minutes to the state police barracks in Millerton, walked in with every detail written down, photos I'd taken of the truck through the fence printed out at CVS. The trooper who took my report, a younger guy named Sergeant Cole, listened to the whole story without interrupting, his face getting more serious with each detail. He made copies of everything, asked me questions Dunham never had, about exact times, about who else might have seen the truck at the station, about whether anyone had threatened me. He promised me they'd investigate, gave me his direct number, told me to call if anything else happened. 2 weeks later, he called to tell me they'd opened an investigation, not just into the hit and run, but into the Riverside Police Department's handling of it. The truth came out in pieces over the next few months. The truck belonged to Officer Dunham's nephew, a kid named Brandon, who'd already had 2 DUIs knocked down to lesser charges. The woman who died was Anna Shelton, a nurse from 2 towns over, who'd been training for a marathon. Her family had been told she'd been hit by an unknown vehicle. Case closed due to lack of evidence. Dunham got fired, Brandon got 5 years for vehicular manslaughter and leaving the scene, and 3 other officers got suspended for helping cover it up. I had to testify at the trial, sitting in that courtroom while Dunham stared at me like I'd betrayed some sacred code. But all I could think about was Anna Shelton's family finally knowing what happened to her. I quit the diner after the trial ended. Couldn't drive past that spot on Highway 22 anymore without feeling sick. Started over at a restaurant in Millerton, closer to the nursing school I finally started attending. Sometimes I still dream about that moment when I saw the truck behind the station. That feeling of realizing the people supposed to protect us were the ones hiding the truth. I'd been living in that little yellow house for exactly 2 weeks when the Richardsons moved in next door. 24 years old, working from home as a graphic designer, I'd chosen this quiet street in small-town Ohio, specifically because nothing ever happened here, or so I thought. My days were predictable. Wake up at 7, make coffee in my kitchen that was weirdly bigger than the living room, sit at my desk by the window, and design logos for startups that would probably fail within 6 months. The house itself was quirky. Bathroom door that scraped against the toilet, exposed brick in the bedroom, original hardwood floors that announced every step. But for $800 a month, I wasn't complaining. My landlord, Mr. Hoffman, lived somewhere in Florida and had made it clear during our single phone conversation that as long as the rent arrived on time, I was basically invisible to him. The Richardsons arrived at 2 in the morning on a Wednesday, which struck me as bizarre even though I was awake anyway, deep in a project for a client who thought urgent meant due yesterday. Through my office window, I watched their moving truck pull up without any of the usual chaos that comes with relocating. 4 people emerged and began unloading boxes in complete silence. No talking, no sounds of exertion, just this eerie coordination that made the hair on my arms stand up. There was a teenage boy wearing a baseball cap pulled so low his face was completely shadowed, and a younger girl, maybe 12, with hair so pale it appeared almost white under the streetlights. The parents looked like anybody you'd pass at a gas station and immediately forget, except for how they moved together like dancers who'd practiced the same routine 1,000 times, never once getting in each other's way. For the first 3 days after they moved in, I kept waiting for normal neighbor stuff to happen. Someone mowing the lawn, kids playing in the yard, maybe a wave when we both happened to check the mail at the same time. Instead, their house stayed completely still, curtains drawn tight across every single window, no lights visible even when darkness fell. The only sign anyone lived there was their car, a beige sedan that left every morning at exactly 7:15 and returned at 5:45, so precise I could set my watch by it. I started paying attention to details I'd never noticed about anyone else, how their garbage cans appeared at the curb at 3 a.m. on collection day, how packages on their porch vanished within minutes of delivery, even though I never saw anyone open the door, how their grass stayed exactly 2 inches tall without anyone ever cutting it. My home office window faced their second-story window, and even though thick burgundy curtains blocked any view inside, I constantly felt eyes on me while I worked. By the second week, that sensation of being watched had evolved into something heavier, like invisible fingers pressing against my temples whenever I sat at my desk. I'd catch myself glancing up from my computer screen every few minutes, expecting to see those curtains pulled aside, but they never moved, not even a flutter from air conditioning or someone brushing past. One afternoon, while designing a website banner, I decided to test my paranoia by suddenly spinning around in my chair, and I swear I saw those burgundy curtains snap back into place, though it happened so fast I couldn't be certain. That night, I started closing my own blinds while working, but the feeling persisted, crawling across my skin like static electricity, making me jumpy enough that I spilled coffee on my keyboard twice in one day. Everything changed on a Friday in early December when I had to drive to Columbus for a client meeting that ran absurdly late. The presentation went well, but the CEO kept asking for just one more revision until it was past 9 when I finally escaped. The 2-hour drive back had me struggling to stay alert, chugging gas station energy drinks and blasting music with the windows cracked despite the freezing temperature. I pulled into my driveway at 11:47 p.m., exhausted and already dreading the follow-up emails I'd have to send in the morning. The Richardson house sat in complete darkness as always, but something felt different. Their car wasn't in its usual spot, parked instead at an odd angle like someone had abandoned it in a hurry. As I fumbled for my keys at the front door, my fingers numb from the cold, the knob turned easily in my hand. The door was already unlocked. My first thought was that I'd forgotten to lock it in my rush to leave that morning. Except, I distinctly remembered checking it twice because I'd left my laptop on the kitchen table. The house was dark, exactly as I'd left it, but the air felt disturbed, like someone had walked through and stirred up all the settled dust. I flipped on the entrance light, and that's when I saw them. Muddy footprints leading from the door through my living room. Huge prints from boots that must have been at least size 13. They tracked across my hardwood floors in deliberate steps, not wandering or exploring, but moving with purpose straight toward the hallway that led to my bedroom and office. The mud was still wet, glistening under the overhead light, and when I knelt down to look closer, I could see bits of red clay mixed in, the kind that came from the construction site 3 blocks away where they were building new condos. Every instinct screamed at me to run back to my car and call the police from somewhere safe, but something made me follow those footprints deeper into my own house. My phone was already in my hand, 911 typed but not yet dialed, my thumb hovering over the call button as I crept forward. The tracks led to my office, where they stopped abruptly at my desk chair, which had been turned to face the window, the exact window that looked directly at the Richardson house. My computer was still there, untouched, but my notebook where I sometimes sketched design ideas was open to a page I hadn't used yet. Someone had drawn something on it with my own pencil, a detailed floor plan of my house, every room labeled correctly, including notes about things only someone who'd been inside would know. Squeaky floorboard here, bathroom door sticks, keeps coffee maker on kitchen table. At the bottom, in handwriting so perfect it looked printed, were the words, "You watch us, we watch you." The moment I read those words, I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps above me in my attic, a space I'd never even accessed because the pull-down ladder was painted shut. The ceiling creaked in a rhythm that suggested someone pacing back and forth, waiting, and then suddenly stopped directly over where I stood. My whole body went rigid as I heard the attic access in the hallway begin to scrape open, paint cracking and falling in little white chips onto the carpet below. I didn't wait to see what would come down. I bolted through my front door and ran to my car, calling 911 as I drove away. The dispatcher kept asking me to slow down and explain clearly. But how could I explain that someone had been living in my attic? Someone who knew my house better than I did. Someone who'd been watching me as closely as I'd been watching that darkened house next door. The police found him 40 minutes later. The Richardsons' teenage son, curled up in my attic with a sleeping bag, empty food wrappers, and 3 notebooks filled with observations about my daily routine. He'd been living up there for 2 weeks, since the day I started closing my blinds, accessing the space through a hidden panel in the back of my bedroom closet that I'd never noticed behind my hanging clothes. The officers said he'd created a small hole in the ceiling, positioned perfectly to watch my office through a gap in the insulation, and had been coming down at night while I slept to use my bathroom and take food from my kitchen. The boy, whose name was Nathan, didn't resist or try to run. He just sat there with this blank expression while the officers cuffed him, never saying a word even when they asked him direct questions. His parents arrived within minutes, standing in my front yard without any visible emotion, and his mother said only one thing to me: "He likes to understand how people live." The truth came out in pieces over the following days through police reports and neighborhood gossip. The Richardsons had moved 7 times in 3 years, always after Nathan became too interested in someone nearby. He wasn't violent, the detective assured me, just obsessive about studying people, learning their patterns until he could predict their every move. The family lived in darkness to avoid drawing attention, keeping Nathan calm by removing stimulation, but I'd become his new fixation the moment I'd shown interest in their strange behavior. They'd found similar setups in previous towns, hidden cameras in vents, detailed logs of neighbors' activities, and twice before, evidence he'd been living in crawl spaces or attics without anyone knowing. The detective said it was the most sophisticated surveillance by a 17-year-old he'd ever seen. Showed me photos of the notebooks where Nathan had written things like, "Subject orders Thai food when stressed, Tuesday, Thursday," and "Checks window at 3:17 p.m. daily after coffee break." I couldn't stay in that house another night, so I packed what I could fit in my car and crashed at a motel for 3 days while I processed what had happened. The violation went deeper than just the physical intrusion. This kid had documented my entire life, knew when I cried after phone calls with my ex, knew which mug I used for coffee versus tea, knew that I sang badly to 80s music while doing laundry on Sundays. The Richardsons disappeared before Nathan's court date, leaving the rental next door abandoned with rent still paid through the month, and the prosecutor said this was their pattern. They'd never stayed for legal proceedings, just vanished and started over somewhere else. I broke my lease, took the financial hit, and moved across town to an apartment complex with security cameras and a doorman. But for months afterward, I'd find myself checking closets for hidden panels, running my hands along ceilings for tiny holes, wondering if someone was cataloging my new routines in another notebook somewhere. 6 months later, I got a letter forwarded from my old address with no return label, just my name written in that same perfect handwriting from the note on my desk. Inside was a single sheet of paper with one line: "You were the most interesting one." I turned it over to the police, but they said without a postmark or any identifying information, there was nothing they could do. I've moved twice more since then, changed jobs, even deleted most of my social media. But sometimes I still wake up at night certain I can hear the ceiling creak above me, even though I live on the top floor now. The detective called me last month to say they'd arrested Nathan in Michigan, living in a family's walls this time, with 17 notebooks full of observations, and when they asked him why he did it, he said he was practicing to become a writer, that the best characters come from real people, and that I'd taught him the most about fear. The night everything went sideways was a Wednesday in late September, around 2016. I was teaching sophomore English at Riverside High, one of those small-town schools where everyone knows everyone's business, and I'd just finished grading a mountain of essays about the Great Gatsby. My wife Laura had texted earlier, asking me to pick up milk on the way home, and I remember being annoyed because the nearest grocery store closed at 9, and it was already past 11. The janitor, old Mr. Hutchins, had locked up hours ago, leaving just me and the flickering fluorescent lights in the teacher's lounge. I'd been putting in these late nights for weeks, trying to catch up after taking over Mrs. Coleman's classes when she went on medical leave. My beat-up Ford pickup was the last vehicle in the parking lot, and the engine coughed twice before starting, same as it had done every cold night for the past 3 winters. The route home took me down County Road 74, this narrow 2-lane stretch that cuts through about 15 miles of farmland and scattered woods before hitting the edge of town where I lived. Most nights I'd make that drive on autopilot, windows down, listening to whatever classic rock station came in clear. But that particular night felt different from the moment I turned off the main highway. The moon was new, leaving everything beyond my headlights wrapped in that thick country darkness that seems to swallow sound. About 6 miles in, right past where the Garrett farm used to be before they sold to developers, my headlights caught something metallic gleaming on the shoulder. As I got closer, I could make out a sedan, maybe a Toyota or Honda, dark blue or black, hard to tell in the dark, pulled over with its hazard lights pulsing that urgent amber rhythm. The car was positioned oddly, not quite parallel to the road, like whoever was driving had yanked the wheel hard and fast to get off the asphalt. My first instinct was to keep driving. You hear stories about fake breakdowns, people pretending to need help just to rob whoever stops. But then I thought about my own daughter, Katie, away at college. What if she was stranded somewhere and nobody stopped? The guilt ate at me for about 30 seconds before I slowed down and pulled in behind the sedan, leaving a good 20 feet between us and keeping my engine running. I grabbed the heavy mag light from under my seat, the one Laura always teased me about carrying like I was some kind of cop, and stepped out. The silence hit me immediately. No traffic, no crickets, even the wind had died down to nothing. I called out a "Hello, everything okay?" But my voice seemed to get absorbed by the darkness around us. The sedan's interior light was on, and through the rear window I could see the driver's seat was empty. Both front doors were closed, but the driver's side wasn't completely latched, like someone had gotten out in a hurry and didn't push it all the way shut. I approached slowly, sweeping the mag light beam across the tall grass on both sides of the road, checking for any sign of the driver. Maybe they'd walked to find cell service or had a medical emergency and someone already picked them up. The car was a 2014 Nissan Altima. I could see the model badge now that I was closer, and the license plate was local, one of those specialty ones with the lighthouse from Port Haven on it. When I reached the driver's door, I used the flashlight to peer inside without touching anything. That's when my chest got tight. There was a wallet splayed open on the driver's seat, credit cards still tucked in their slots, and an iPhone face down on the passenger seat with the screen still lit up showing missed calls. A half-empty coffee cup sat in the holder, steam still faintly rising from it, and the keys dangled from the ignition. The radio was on but turned down low, barely audible, playing some talk show about local politics. I pulled out my phone to call 911, but the screen showed no bars. Dead zone, which wasn't unusual for this stretch of road. The smart thing would have been to drive to where I had signal and report it, but something made me walk around the car first, checking for any signs of an accident or struggle. The grass beside the passenger side was flattened in a weird pattern, not like someone had walked through it, more like something heavy had been dragged. The trail led about 10 feet into the field before disappearing where the grass grew taller. I followed it with my flashlight, calling out again, "Hey, anyone out there? I'm here to help." The beam caught something white against the dark earth. A shoe, a woman's sneaker, size 7 or 8, lying on its side with the laces still tied. My mouth went dry. I picked it up, and that's when I noticed the foot impression in the mud next to it, perfectly preserved, like whoever lost the shoe had stepped right out of it while running. The rational part of my brain kept saying there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the driver had a mental health episode, got confused, wandered off. Maybe they were diabetic, had low blood sugar, got disoriented. But the scene didn't add up. Why leave the wallet and phone? Why only one shoe? I walked back to my truck and grabbed the emergency kit from behind the seat, then returned to the Altima. Using my sleeve to avoid leaving fingerprints, I carefully opened the driver's door wider. The wallet belonged to someone named Melissa Vaughn, 32 years old according to her license, lived over in Riverside Heights, about 40 minutes away. Her face in the photo looked tired but kind, the sort of person who probably worked 2 jobs and still volunteered at her kids' school. There were photos tucked behind the license, 2 young boys in baseball uniforms, a golden retriever, what looked like a family barbecue. Normal life stuff that made my stomach knot up even tighter. The phone on the passenger seat kept lighting up with notifications. Missed calls from Hub and texts asking, "Where are you?" And kids are asking about dinner. I knew I shouldn't touch it, but I needed to call for help somehow. I leaned across and pressed the home button with my knuckle. The lock screen showed 11:47 p.m. and 17 missed calls. The most recent text, from just 3 minutes ago, read, "Mel, I'm getting worried. Your location sharing shows you stopped on County Road. Please call me." That meant her husband could see where the car was. I memorized his number from the screen, planning to call him from my phone once I got signal. But then I heard something that made every muscle in my body tense up. A car engine in the distance getting closer. Out here, maybe 3 cars passed by on a typical night, and it was almost midnight on a Wednesday. I turned toward the sound and saw headlights coming from the direction of town, moving slower than normal, like they were searching for something. The vehicle, a white panel van with no windows in the back, crept along at maybe 15 miles per hour. When it got close enough for the driver to see my truck and the Altima, it stopped completely, sitting there in the middle of the road for what felt like forever but was probably only 10 seconds. I raised my hand in a wave, trying to look friendly and normal, but the van didn't move. I couldn't see through the windshield with their headlights blazing, but I had the distinct feeling I was being studied, evaluated. Then, without warning, the van's engine revved and it sped past us, accelerating hard enough that I heard the tires squeal slightly on the asphalt. I watched the taillights disappear around the bend, and that's when I noticed something that made my scalp prickle. There was mud splattered on the van's back doors, fresh and wet, the same dark clay color as the soil where I'd found that shoe. My brain started connecting dots I didn't want to connect. I decided I'd seen enough. Whatever happened to Melissa Vaughn, I wasn't equipped to handle it alone out here in the dark. I jogged back to my truck, locked the doors, and drove fast toward town until my phone finally showed 2 bars near the old water tower. I pulled over and called 911, explaining everything to the dispatcher. The abandoned car, the wallet and phone, the shoe in the field, the strange van. She said units were on their way and asked me to wait there to guide them to the scene. While waiting, I called the number I'd memorized from Melissa's phone. Her husband answered on the first ring, his voice cracking when he said, "Mel?" I had to tell him it wasn't her, that I'd found her car, that police were coming. The sound he made when I mentioned finding her shoe. It wasn't quite a sob, more like all the air leaving his body at once. He kept asking if there was blood, if I'd seen any blood, and I told him no, which was true. But somehow that didn't seem to comfort either of us. 2 sheriff's deputies arrived about 20 minutes later, and I led them back to the scene. Except when we got to the spot where the Altima had been, where I knew with absolute certainty it had been parked, there was nothing. No car, no tire tracks on the shoulder, no flattened grass where I'd walked. Even the shoe I'd stupidly left sitting on the hood of the car was gone. The deputies looked at me like I was drunk or crazy, shining their flashlights around while I insisted this was the exact location. I knew this road like the back of my hand, right past the old Whitman property. There's the crooked fence post I'd noted as a landmark. One deputy asked if maybe I'd gotten confused in the dark, suggested maybe it was further up the road. But I knew. This was the spot. The other deputy called dispatch to verify my 911 call, and while he did, his partner found something. A single tire track in the soft shoulder, fresh, like something heavy had recently pulled over. But that was it. No other evidence that anything I'd described had happened. The deputies took my statement, wrote everything down, but I could tell they thought I'd either imagined it or was leaving something out. They said they'd check with the Vaughn family, run the plate number I'd remembered, but their tone suggested they were humoring me. I drove home in a daze, walked into my house at almost 2 a.m. to find Laura asleep on the couch with the TV still on. I didn't wake her. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table with a beer and tried to make sense of what I'd seen. The next morning, I called in sick to work, something I never did, and drove back out to County Road 74 in broad daylight. The spot looked different in the sun. Ordinary, just a stretch of road between fields. I parked and searched the grass where I'd found the shoe. But there was nothing, not even the drag marks I'd seen so clearly the night before. The earth looked undisturbed, like it had been smoothed over. I drove into town and stopped at the sheriff's office, but the deputy at the desk said there was no missing person report for anyone named Melissa Vaughn, no abandoned vehicle report, nothing in the system at all from the night before except my call. That evening, I couldn't stop myself from driving to Riverside Heights, to the address I'd seen on Melissa's license. The house was there, a modest two-story with a worn basketball hoop in the driveway, and those same two boys from the wallet photos playing in the front yard. But when I knocked and asked the woman who answered about Melissa Vaughn, she looked at me blankly and said nobody by that name lived there, that she and her husband had been renting the place for 5 years. The boys called her Mom, and she looked nothing like the face I'd seen on that driver's license. I apologized for the confusion and left, but as I was walking to my truck, one of the boys, maybe 8 years old, tugged on my sleeve. He whispered, "She told us not to talk about the lady who came asking about our house yesterday. Are you with her?" When I asked what lady, his mother called him inside sharply, and they both disappeared behind the door. I heard the deadbolt turn. That was 3 years ago, and I still drive County Road 74 to get home, though I've never seen anything unusual again. But sometimes, on dark nights when I pass that spot, I slow down without meaning to, searching for hazard lights that aren't there. I remember that night clearly because it was supposed to be simple, almost comforting. Our little town doesn't host big events, so the annual fair was something people actually looked forward to. I had gone after work, still in my uniform, mostly just to grab a funnel cake and walk around under the string lights. I wasn't there long, maybe an hour or so, before heading back to my car. It had been parked on a side street, a block away from the main lot where most people gathered. When I reached the car, the windshield looked strange under the streetlight. There was a piece of paper tucked beneath the wiper blade, folded once down the middle. My first thought was that it was a church pamphlet or some coupon for a local business. I didn't think much of it until I slid into the driver's seat, set it on the passenger side, and actually opened it. It wasn't a flyer for anything. No logo, no design. Just a list written in neat, blocky handwriting. Each line was a date followed by a time, all spaced out like someone had copied them from a planner. At first, I didn't connect the dots. I thought maybe it was some random schedule someone dropped, and it ended up under my wiper by mistake. But then I saw the exact shift I had worked 2 nights earlier, right down to the time I clocked out. I skimmed down the page, and it wasn't just 1 or 2 matches. It was every single day that week, with the hours I came and went. My chest tightened as it hit me. This wasn't random at all. At the bottom of the page, written slightly larger than the rest, was a short message. "See you soon." That's when the fun, easy glow of the fair turned sour in my mind. I had been walking through crowds, standing in line for snacks and weaving between strangers. At some point during all that, someone who knew my schedule close enough to trace it had slipped this onto my car. And the thought that they had been watching me that carefully made me feel suddenly exposed in a way I'd never experienced before. I sat in the car with the engine off for a good minute, reading the list again and again. My first instinct was to check the sidewalks around me, scanning the people drifting back from the fair. None of them were looking my way, but I couldn't shake the idea that whoever had written this might still be close enough to see my reaction. The paper felt heavier in my hands than it should have, like it carried more weight than just ink on a page. Driving home was a blur. Every pair of headlights behind me seemed to linger too long, and I caught myself checking the rearview mirror more than the road ahead. The flyer stayed on the passenger seat, and I couldn't bring myself to toss it out the window or crumple it. Part of me wanted to keep it as proof, in case I had to show someone, but part of me hated having it so close, like it was some kind of open channel between me and whoever had written it. When I got back to my apartment, I went straight to my laptop and pulled up the flyer again under the desk lamp. The handwriting wasn't messy, but it wasn't formal either, just blocky with strange consistency, like the person had taken their time to make sure it was legible. The dates were in order, perfectly matched with the times I'd arrived and left work, even the shift I had traded with a coworker at the last minute. That detail is what made my stomach twist the hardest. Whoever tracked me hadn't just been guessing. They knew my movements as if they had been there every step of the way. I thought about calling someone, maybe my manager, maybe even the police, but what would I even say? Someone left a paper on my car that shows they've been following me. It felt flimsy, like they'd brush it off unless something worse happened. Still, the words, "See you soon," circled in my head like a warning I didn't know how to answer. I ended up shoving the paper into a drawer, but sleep never came easy that night. Every creak in the walls, every sound of a car pulling away outside, left me wondering if I had already been marked for whatever soon was supposed to mean. The following day, I couldn't shake the paranoia. I parked farther from the store, checked around my car before unlocking it, and even asked a coworker to walk with me to the lot after closing. Nothing unusual happened, but that flyer never left my mind. By the time my shift ended, the lot was nearly empty. I forced myself to look at every vehicle around me, memorizing their plates and shapes like I'd have to identify them later. On the third day, I finally brought the flyer to the local police station. The officer at the desk read it twice, his expression tightening in small ways he probably didn't realize I noticed. He asked if I had any recent conflicts or if someone might be holding a grudge. I told him no, and that the detail about my traded shift meant the person wasn't just guessing. He took the paper, said they'd keep it on file, but I could tell they weren't planning to launch an investigation unless something escalated. For weeks, I kept waiting for the next move. Every knock at my door made me tense. Every phone notification made me glance twice. I changed up my parking spots, varied my routes to work, even stayed with my sister a few nights just to feel less alone. But nothing else ever came. No more flyers, no strange calls, no obvious signs of someone tailing me. It was like whoever left that note wanted me to know they'd been close, then vanished once the fear had sunk in deep enough. To this day, I still don't know what their goal was. Maybe it was meant as a threat, or maybe just a twisted way to get inside my head. Either way, it worked. I never went back to the town fair again, and I still glance at my windshield every time I return to my car. That single piece of paper changed the way I move through my life, reminding me that someone, somewhere, had mapped out my routine without me ever noticing, until they decided to sign it with, "See you soon." Moving into that small town felt like stepping onto a stage where everyone already knew the script except me. I had just landed a new job at a modest accounting firm, and the place seemed quiet, predictable, and easy to adapt to. My apartment sat above a bakery that smelled of fresh bread every morning, and the rhythm of life was slower than anything I was used to. At first, it felt almost comforting. People waved on the street, asked where I was from, and seemed genuinely curious. But after only a week, a strange pattern started to creep into nearly every conversation I had. The first time it happened, I was grabbing a sandwich from a small diner near my office. The waitress, an older woman with sharp cheekbones and hair tied back so tightly it looked like it hurt, leaned in when I asked about places to explore. She chuckled and said, "Just don't go past the water tower after dark." I laughed politely, thinking it was some folksy warning meant as a joke, like telling newcomers not to whistle at night or they'll summon ghosts. I brushed it off. But then, 2 days later, my landlord said the exact same words as he fixed a leaky faucet in the kitchen. By the end of the month, I'd heard it at least half a dozen times. Different people, the grocery clerk, a teenager ringing me up at the gas station, even one of my co-workers, all dropped the same line, almost word for word. "Don't go past the water tower after dark." Some laughed like they were in on a private joke. Others said it flatly, with no trace of humor. The repetition unsettled me, though I tried to rationalize it as small-town charm, maybe an inside reference I wasn't clued in on yet. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being tested, like the whole town wanted to see how I'd react. Curiosity got the better of me, and one evening I walked out toward the tower just before sunset. The structure stood at the edge of town, rust streaking down its sides, its frame surrounded by dry weeds and a chain-link fence with holes patched badly with wire. I stood there for a few minutes, waiting for something, anything to happen. The silence pressed down on me, broken only by the distant hum of cicadas. Nothing unusual happened that night, but the way every passerby glanced at me when I walked back through town, as if I had crossed some invisible line, made my skin prickle with unease. A few nights later, I decided to ask one of my coworkers about it. His name was Mark, a quiet guy who rarely joined in on office chatter but always stayed late. I casually brought it up while we were leaving together, joking about how everyone seemed to recycle the same line. For the first time since I'd met him, he actually paused mid-step. He didn't laugh or smile, he just said, "Some things are better left alone," and then walked off toward his truck without another word. That response lodged itself in my mind, replaying whenever I passed the tower on my commute. My curiosity turned into something heavier, not just interest, but this nagging need to understand. One Saturday, I went to the small public library downtown. The building smelled like dust and old carpet, the kind of place where time felt thicker. I dug into archived newspapers, flipping through local sections that barely covered more than bake sales and high school football games. There was nothing about the tower, not even a passing mention. But then, tucked inside a box labeled miscellaneous, I found photocopies of police incident summaries. The strange part was that none of them carried official stamps or case numbers. The reports described people, locals, drifters, even a traveling salesman, who had gone missing near the old tower over the span of nearly 3 decades. The wording was eerily similar in each one, as though whoever wrote them had copied from a template. Some included notes in the margins: "Family insists last seen by tower," or "Patrol car reported lights near structure." It was all informal, scribbled like reminders, not formal documentation. My pulse quickened as I realized these were never filed as official cases. It felt like stumbling across something I wasn't supposed to read. When I left the library that evening, the town looked different. The streets were emptier than usual, and I noticed how the tower loomed from nearly every angle, like it had been waiting for me to notice it properly. I drove home with the windows up, glancing at the structure whenever it broke the horizon. That night, I couldn't sleep. The creaks of my apartment felt louder, and every time headlights swept across my blinds, I expected them to stop, to park outside. I kept hearing that same line echoing in my mind, except now it didn't feel like a joke anymore. It felt like a warning. The next evening, I drove out toward the tower again, this time after dark. The road leading there was barely lit, cracked asphalt swallowed by weeds. When I parked near the fence, the air felt heavier, like the stillness itself had weight. I switched off the engine and sat for a minute, the metal frame of the tower creaking faintly in the night air. I thought about the reports, about the people who never made it back. My gut told me to leave, but something deeper told me I had already gone too far to just turn around. As I stepped closer, I noticed faint markings on the fence, carved into the metal posts. Initials, dates, crude symbols. Some looked fresh, others rusted over with time. I pressed my hand against the cold wire, and for a split second, I could have sworn I heard movement beyond the tower, like footsteps in gravel. But the lot was empty, and when I turned my flashlight that way, nothing reflected back except weeds and dirt. Still, the sound lingered in my ears long after it had gone. I went home shaken, but determined to put this obsession to rest. The following day, I visited the sheriff's office under the pretense of asking about neighborhood safety. The deputy at the front desk, a man with tired eyes and a thick mustache, gave me a long look when I casually mentioned the tower. He leaned forward and said quietly, "If you want to keep your job here, don't dig into things that don't concern you." Then he slid a stack of unrelated brochures toward me and walked away. That was the only answer I ever got from law enforcement in that town. From that point on, I stopped asking questions. I never went back to the tower, never even drove near it again. People still made the same joke. Don't go past the water tower after dark, but I learned to smile and nod, pretending it didn't bother me. Inside, though, I carried the weight of those reports and the silence that surrounded them. I don't know if the warnings were superstition, ritual, or something darker, but I know one thing: I listened. And maybe that's why I'm still here to tell the story.